In this episode of the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast, we will discuss the news of the day, which is somewhat draft related, and it is in reference to Brandon Miller and the situation that he was, I guess you could say he was directly or indirectly involved in, which ended up resulting in someone losing their life. So we will talk about, should he continue to play? And is Alabama in the wrong for not suspending him? Stay tuned. Big shout out to each and every person that has made the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast your first listen of the day. And this episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. If you're a first-time user, you can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That is prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. Right, I am your host, Rafael Barlowe, the director of scouting for NBA Big Board and the founder of NBA Draft Junkies, and my co-host for today is Leif Thulin. Leif, how is everything going your way, and how was your All-Star Weekend experience?
Everything's going well for me right now. I'm just watching a lot of college hoops, a little snowstorm in Salt Lake, so I'm cooped up. As for the All-Star experience, I didn't go in. I didn't want to pay. The Jazz credentials weren't going to get me in for the NBA. But I enjoyed watching it with my family. And I hadn't really watched it with my whole family in years. Usually I'd watch it with my friends, and it kind of took me back to when I was like a little kid, and Darren Williams set the old skills challenge records. So that was a little nostalgic fun for me.
Okay, so the weather got bad. I'm glad I got out in time, because I imagine.
Yeah, no, it is dumping snow right now. There's about 1.5 feet of snow on the ground right now.
Man, I guess that's perfect timing for the NBA. It would be really bad if that happened during All-Star Weekend. I live in Dallas, and I want to say one year we had the Super Bowl 2010-ish or something like that, and we got dumped with snow. And Dallas is not prepared for snow like that. But I do remember it was a good weekend for me because this was before Uber. There were a lot of people that came in town for Super Bowl parties, and they rented cars, but they did not know how to get around, and they didn't want to risk driving in a city that they were unfamiliar with. And I remember somebody asked me how much would I charge to drive somebody from Dallas to Fort Worth for a party, and I jokingly said $300. And they came back and was like, the offer's good. So I was doing Uber before Uber was even out. But yeah, so that just shows how the weather can impact things. But let's get to the big story of the day. It is somewhat draft related because Alabama's Brandon Miller is, in my opinion, I had him as the number 3 prospect on my big board, and it's really too early to say how it will impact his draft status, which is not really important right now, considering that a life was lost in this senseless shooting. And before I just ask for your opinion, let me run down the facts, or at least what I have read, just to be clear with everything. Brandon Miller, who is the leading scorer on the Alabama team, which is number 2 in the country, he brought his teammate, or former teammate, Darius Miles's gun, which was used in a fatal shooting. The big question is, did Miller bring Miles's gun because he thought Miles was in danger, or did he bring the gun because Miles just made a request? But all we know is that Darius Miles made a request. I think the gun was in Brandon Miller's car. I guess they went to like a bar or club or something like that. Miller left, went home because the line was long, but Darius Miles's gun was in the car. Miles made a phone call, called Brandon Miller. Brandon Miller brought the gun. Darius Miles ended up shooting, or another guy that was involved ended up, I guess, firing 8 shots into a car, which killed a 23-year-old woman. So, I mean, it's just crazy that we're even talking about this on an NBA Draft podcast. And Darius Miles and the other man, I guess they're being charged with capital murder. And here's a part where it kind of involves Brandon Miller. His windshield was struck twice by gunfire, and there are reports that his car was blocking the road where the victim's car was. We don't know whether that was intentional. We don't know if he brought the gun, and we just don't know, but it doesn't sound good, right? But Brandon Miller has not been charged. And I've seen reports that are false, according to what I've read. He did not hand Miles the gun. The gun was registered to Darius Miles, but it was in Brandon Miller's car. And again, Miller has not been charged. The Tuscaloosa chief DA, Paula Whitley, has says that's not a question I can answer regarding Brandon Miller, his involvement. She says that he's not charged because, quote, there's nothing we could charge him with. And the big topic is Nate Oats. And is his job in jeopardy? I mean, I think there was, some people are saying lack of institutional control. And he made a quote that was very interesting. That's kind of like got him in a lot of hot water in a sense. And here's the quote from Alabama coach Nate Oats. We knew about that regarding Brandon Miller. Can't control everything everybody does outside of practice. Nobody knew that was going to happen. College kids are out. Brandon hasn't been in any type of trouble, nor is he in any type of trouble in this case. Wrong spot at the wrong time. All right, so that was a long breakdown of the events. So first of all, share your thoughts on Nate Oats's quote.
Well, Nate Oats, I think, is deservedly under hot water because he kind of took away the responsibility that is being a head coach. Like, this is your program. It's not the players' program. In the NBA, the players kind of run things. In college, you're the figurehead, and rightfully so. And even though Brandon Miller's a star, and that's why it's making headlines now, because it's like, oh, it's Brandon Miller's car that's dented with 2 bullets, and it's Brandon Miller who provided the gun. And there's a text that said the heat is in the hat, meaning the gun was in the car for Darius Miles, which makes people very curious, and rightfully so. It's Nate Oats that is really drawing heat right now because he said we knew about that and we can't control everything everybody does outside of practice. I don't know why you would say that. It almost sounds like it's an excuse and like, hey, I coach them in basketball. I don't care about their livelihood. I don't care about this. And I don't think that's necessarily what he wants to admit, but that's, I think, the emotion he's evoked for the people who read this, and he's kind of under some hot water. The question I have is really, if Brandon Miller, if they've known about this, like obviously about it right away because he's got 2 bullets denting his car, and it's Brandon Miller's car, and you see that these texts are exchanged. What does this mean about Alabama having played him during this investigation with it just coming out now? Why does it impact it? And should it? And I'm kind of conflicted about that, honestly, because if Brandon Miller there's nothing we could charge Miller with, is what Paula Whitley said. And then Davis and Miles, the 2 people who are convicted of murder.
They've only been charged. They haven't been convicted.
Yeah, sorry. Excuse me. That was wrong. I was going to say possibly convicted and skip that one.
We don't want the people saying that.
Thank you. I fully intended to say that.
Right.
But my final point is, if Brandon Miller was an accomplice, but they say he's got nothing he could be charged with, I wonder why it's making the rounds now when the police already knew everything that could have been known. And so that's why I'm curious about what it means for Brandon Miller going forward, because I'm sure this isn't the first time it's been known about, as Oates alluded to. He said we knew about that at the very start of his press conference.
Yeah, and that's the big question. Should he play? And is Alabama wrong for covering this up? And also, you'd have to wonder if it was not Brandon Miller, if it was Brandon Jones or Brandon Smith, who is the 12th man or a walk-on, would he still be on the team? And I'd have to answer probably not, because somebody that's at the back end of the rotation potentially bringing this type of negative attention to university, they probably wouldn't deal with it. When we return, we'll go into a little bit more detail or a little bit more in depth about our thoughts about whether or not he should play or not. But let's talk about Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. And you wondering how it works? You just pick 2 to 6 players, and if they would go score more or less than their prize picks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It is just you versus the projections available. And Prize Picks offers projections on any sport that you watch: NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, WNBA, men's and women's college basketball. They even have cricket. And entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It is that easy. It is safe, and you can get your money out quickly. And it is also currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. So download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com and sign up daily so you can play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit 50, Prize Picks will give you 50. So do not forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for instant deposit match up to $100. And once again, you're listening to the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast. I'm your host, Rafael Barlowe, with my co-host, Leif Thulin. And this is a situation that we were not expecting to cover today. I had no idea until today that Brandon Miller was even remotely involved in a situation, but Alabama knew, and it seems like they covered it up. And like Leif, I'm somewhat conflicted on if he should play or not, because if he hasn't been charged, then I mean, do you suspend him for just being there? And if you say yes, I mean, I have to respect your opinion. I can totally understand why you would say yes, because like we mentioned at the end of the last segment, if his name was not Brandon Miller, if he wasn't averaging 18 points and 9 rebounds or 8 or 9 rebounds per game, he probably would be suspended or kicked off the team. So my question for you, Leif, is, and I saw this on a tweet, and I kind of paraphrased it a little bit. And this is just your opinion. There's no right or wrong answer here. Should Brandon Miller be held responsible for another man's actions once he returns the man's property to him?
I don't have a definitive answer, but I'll say my gut reaction to it was, okay, if someone's asking for a gun and you leave it in your car when he's out in a public place, I certainly am skeptical. That said, it's your teammate. You want to see the best in people, and there's a way to make an argument that he was doing this without any knowledge or complicit behavior. And so I don't want to stamp the label of like he's abetting what a horrible crime that did occur. But at the same time, it's hard to overlook the fact that like guns are dangerous, and he brought it into a loaded place with students. And even though it wasn't his, it was Darius Miles's, and he had no part, he wasn't there. To hide it in his car in a place that was so loaded with people, the Alabama, it was kind of like a college town. It's a strip mall in Tuscaloosa. It makes me feel as if that there's some culpability just based off the just on the location and timing. It seems weird. So I think there's got to be some repercussion. That said, if there's none that have came up legally, I don't see why a news report that it had been common knowledge for Alabama and the police department, why that would make him unable to play. So I'm personally conflicted, but legally it sounds like he'll likely be able to continue playing. I wonder if Nate Oats will bear more of the responsibility, though.
Yeah, that's my question. Like, is it really fair to put this on Nate Oats? I do think his comment made sense because you can't control what happens. But it's one of those things where once you say it, it just sounds really bad once you say it. Because, and I'll use myself, for example. Let's say I did something crazy or stupid at All-Star Weekend in Salt Lake. Our founder, David Locke, is not responsible for what I do or what you do in your off time. It really has nothing to do. But then again, we're adults, so we're not college students. So that may make it a little bit of a difference. But I think what makes the situation even worse is this is the second, I guess maybe you can even say the third, if you count the Imani Bates situation, the third high profile case in college basketball involving a gun. Two of them which was I'm referring to a situation that between New Mexico State, where someone a player was shot and then he ended up killing somebody in retaliation. But I mean, we've seen 3 different times, like high profile in the last few months, regarding a college basketball player and a gun. And I'm anti-gun. I don't own a gun. I've never shot a gun. I think the world would be a better place if nobody had it. And I feel like I'm in the minority because we live in the United States where, you take a woman on a date to the gun range, which is crazy to me. I've lived in different countries where people don't have guns. But anyway, I do feel like when he wasn't wrong for what he said or how he feels about it, but I mean, he's going to get backlash for it. Now, do you think that he's going to possibly like lose his job for lack of institutional control?
You never know in this type of society. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, based off like all these cheating allegations, like Rick Pitino's cheating seems tame compared to what's now appropriate. And I bring up that and that illusion because you see a guy like Chris Beard lose his job, and now the charges have been dismissed, and
Yep.
that was very, very serious, and that was a high profile job at Texas. And so now, if a coach at a place like Alabama has this under his wing, is it very serious? Absolutely. But how much culpability does he personally bear for the actions of another? And even though it's his program, and I think his comments were more, if I think those were inflammatory and may put him under more fire than if he had just said, oh, you know what, like this is a horrible tragedy and just left it at that, even if it was that simple and cut and dry and maybe stark. But I just have a hard time seeing that someone get fired over a PR stunt that's not like he didn't say anything horrible. He just was insensitive to his like the program and maybe read the situation in the wrong room, read the room wrong and put the situation at hand. But like for instance, Chris Beard absolutely had something he did that was negative, and Rick Pitino cheated and he was fired. But I think it's the personal culpability, so I think he retains his job.
What's really crazy about the situation that just came to my mind is, in reference to NBA prospects, Baba Miller was suspended like half the season over $3,000. Wow. Brandon Miller, is somewhat involved in this situation where someone lost their life and he hasn't been suspended. It just shows the total inconsistencies of, I mean, just college basketball. I mean, I feel like our laws in the United States are just totally inconsistent. But on one hand, I could see if he hasn't been charged with anything, you can make a case and say that he shouldn't be suspended if he hasn't been charged. But it's such a crazy situation. And once again, we don't want to sound insensitive and make this more about the basketball aspect of it as opposed to just someone lost their life in this situation. Multiple lives are altered, whether it's, I mean, the woman who was killed, she was a mother. I mean, it's just a tragic situation. But I feel like by this being Locked On NBA Draft or Locked On NBA Big Board, and we cover the draft, I think it would be kind of wrong for us to totally just ignore the situation and not cover it. I mean, I'm kind of struggling for words because, I mean, I don't have any background in covering situations like this. And so it just kind of stinks for everybody involved. But definitely have prayers out to, the family and the children of the woman that lost her life. When you return, I guess we'll just have to talk a little bit about the NBA perspective and what's next possibly for Brandon Miller. But before we get into that, if you're looking to eat healthy, then I have the perfect treat for you. It is a Built Bar. You're probably wondering, what is a Built Bar? Well, it is a delicious treat that tastes good and does not have all the fat and calories in a typical candy bar. But what makes it similar to a candy bar, it is 100% real chocolate, and it comes in tasty flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond, and again, it is healthy for you. Again, it tastes like a candy bar, 100% real chocolate. healthy, only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And if you want a box, you don't have to order them. Before, you used to have to go to build.com. Now you can go to Walmart or Sam's Club. And if you go to Walmart, they're in the pharmacy section, and you can grab a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. And if you want more, if 4 is not enough, then you can just go to Sam's. I know, like where I live, there's usually a Sam's right next to Walmart. You can go to Sam's. If you have a membership, you can get a 13-bar box with brownie batter, churro. But if you want to order, you can still order them at built.com. All right, last segment. This has been easily the most difficult show for me to record because, again, I don't want to be insensitive to the situation, but when you are a podcast host and you have to cover current events, then you just kind of have to cover current events. So from the NBA perspective, I think Brandon Miller is going to have a lot of questions to answer. I think what happens with him next and going forward, and this is just my opinion, let me know if you agree or disagree. I think it's going to depend on the public, right? If the public is, heavily criticizing Alabama and they're putting pressure on them not to play him, then I think the school will not play him. If it's a situation where there's not a bunch of public pressure, then I'm going to assume that they're going to play him and they're going to chase the national title. They're in position to be a number 1 seed. They're ranked number 2 in the country right now. And this is arguably the best Alabama basketball team in history. So what are your thoughts as far as like the next steps regarding like NBA for Brandon Miller? And how does this impact your big board?
I would say I agree with your thought that it really just depends on the perspective of the consensus and the kind of the representation that Alabama puts forth based off the ramifications that the law and some boosters put on Nate Oats and the basketball program. So obviously, if there's some legal stuff that comes out, but at this point, knowing what we know, I'd imagine Brandon Miller will be playing at some point the rest of the season. I could imagine there's a chance he gets suspended for the short term. And it almost feels like a kind of PR stunt when it would be short term. If I wouldn't be thrilled with that, I'd rather than be full hog or no suspension than, here's 2 games and it's just a slap on the wrist. As for the NBA perspective, I think the guys that pick 3rd through 7th overall, where I don't think 7th was likely, but I'll put that whole range out there, are really going to have to do their homework more so, because all that I'd heard, and I don't have too many connections, but I'd heard a lot of people with more connections than myself and college basketball coaches. Like I listened to a podcast and a couple coaches that are now coaching elsewhere were recruiting him, and they all had nothing but shine for him and said he was super mature, that he was really unselfish. All he wants to do is win. He's kind of a quiet kid. And that stuff matters to NBA teams when they're trying to figure out, is this the guy we want to build our franchise around? So now if he were like a 30th pick, I don't think this matters as much to it absolutely does. I just don't think it matters as much as like we're building our franchise around this, and it could crumble at any point if something happens. So people are going to really be more cautious and tread more carefully when evaluating Brandon Miller, and it's more than just basketball. So I think it negatively impacts the stock, but I don't want to say that he'll really drop down the draft because he is a premier talent, and if he's innocent and he's not held culpable for providing a gun that was used to for a murder. And
it's crazy that we're talking about this
for
a murder.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's hard to talk about with basketball. Like it just doesn't seem like it's on subject. But the fact of the matter is if he's innocent and he does continue to play, there's just more homework to do. But I don't think he really slides that far. But that's a big if. If it turns out the other way, there's a whole nother slew of things that can happen, and I don't want to speculate too far down that road.
Yeah, for me, when I do my big boards, I don't factor in intel like as far as like I do use intel from NBA teams, but it is strictly based off of performance. And when I do my big boards, I don't do my big boards based off of intel that is related to a person's background. Because number one, if let's just say there's a guy that is a top 2 or 3 prospect in the draft, and I have him down to number 18, and I know he's probably gonna fall that far because of some questionable stuff in his background. It would be hard for me to like lie when people are like, why do you have such and such a number 18? And do I say, well, because I know that this is in his background. So usually when I do my big boards and my drafts, I don't include any background intel. That, we don't really hear about that too often. We just kind of see it during the draft. Sometimes when you see a guy that just continues to slide and slide and slide. So I'm gonna be consistent with that. I'm still gonna have him number 3 on my big board based off of his play and his performance. But I do think things are gonna be different because, like you said, everything I heard about him was he was a great kid. Never heard anything bad. I hear different things about people in their background, and if they have a reputation for having a bad attitude, being lazy, so on. Never heard anything about him. And he's just going to have to answer a lot of questions. There's going to have to be a strong, I guess, PR element into his interview process. And I still think that it's all going to totally depend on how the public reacts within the next few days. If the public reacts, if they come out harsh against him and Nate Oats, and if there's some type of protest or anything like that, which is totally possible, and if I honestly understand if there were, then I think that is going to have the biggest impact on his draft status as opposed to actually what happened. Because I don't think if there's no protest and he plays and Alabama wins, people are gonna, and they people just kind of not make a big deal out of it, then I don't think it will have much of an impact on where he is drafted. All right, so if you had to make a bet, and I guess you kind of covered it a little bit, and it's the last question. Again, this has been a tough show to record, but if you had to like make a bet, what do you think happens? Do you think he finishes out the season? Do you think he's suspended for a couple of games? Which is weird. Like you said, it would be like a PR thing, because if you didn't suspend him when you first heard about it, why would you suspend him now that it became public? So do you think he'll get suspended for a couple games, the remainder of the season, or do you think it'd be business as usual?
So the social media makes me believe, like the era that we are in right now makes me believe there's a chance that the ramifications are severe and he sits out. But my gut is that if he wasn't suspended when Alabama and the police and people that are important in this whole situation knew about it, that he'll end up playing. I could see the situation, which I think, like I mentioned, it is silly, like suspending him 2-3 games, playing out. But I think you'll see Brandon Miller on a basketball court. One thing that came to my mind, this is a little different, I just wanted to throw this out here, is Ray Lewis had a whole situation, and I don't want to get too legal into this, but he was in some deep water, and he played 12 more years. And sometimes and this is a little pessimistic, but it's different, obviously, in this case. It's that talent overshines some of this stuff. And we 100%. Talked about, like, if his name was anything different, if he was an NBA draft prospect, if he wasn't scoring 19 and not 8, that he'd be off the team. But like the Ray Lewis thing popped in my head because I watched the Bullies of Baltimore, the new 30 for 30. And Ray Lewis was given this like ability with money and fame and just supernatural ability to really carve himself out of this new persona. And I wonder if, like, with the ability that Brandon Miller has and the power that Alabama sports has on society, does winning cure all? And I'm not saying that's right. It's just where my gut leans is what's going to happen.
Yeah, and that is, it's so true. It's like the more talented you are, the longer leash that you have. I mean, the Ray Lewis situation, again, we're talking about a tragedy. I remember it like it was yesterday when it happened. And there wasn't social media back then, so you had to watch it on the news or read different newspapers. And I mean, there was a lot of backlash, and my personal opinion is because it was Ray Lewis, and I'll just say there was a way that he was able to continue to play. I guess I don't want to really give my opinion here because I don't want that to turn into a whole different subject. But I think the situation would be totally different if he were a third string linebacker from Miami of Ohio instead of from the U. And speaking of social media, I feel like the reactions on social media were pretty mixed because I think depending on what you read, like some of the headlines I feel like made it seem worse. Well, I don't want to say that. Some of the headlines that I read, I felt were a little clickbaitish. The headlines made it seem like he came there, he handed him the gun and was totally involved. And then some of them I read, like, I think it's like AL.com. You would like read it and they have like a small sentence on Brandon Miller, while other more sports related sites made the whole entire article about Brandon Miller. Now, I did see one article where they say, and I talked about it earlier, where the cars or his car was blocking the exit or blocking the car of the victims. That sounds really, really awful. We just don't know if it was intentional or we just don't know. But depending on what you read, you could easily have read an article that said, Miles made a phone call, Miller pulls up, gives him the gun, shots ring out, and the victim's car couldn't get away because Brandon Miller's car was blocking it. That sounds horrible. But then some of the other articles I read did not have that at all. So depending on what people read is based off their opinions, which is like the good and the danger of social media. So the next couple of days are going to be really interesting. On one hand, it is like kind of dominating the news, but I feel like it's not as big of a story that I thought it would be. Like, I mean, even if you go to ESPN right now and is recording this at 12:16 a.m. Central Time, the Hawks fired Nate McMillan is the top headline, right? As far as like their headlines. I mean, this situation comes up second. The Michigan State Indiana game is like it's like the first thing you see. So the next few days are going to be very, very interesting, and we'll just see what happens. Well, that wraps up this very, very difficult episode. Big shout out to Leif for coming on. He could have easily said, I don't want to tackle this situation. And I thought you gave very, very good insight without, saying anything that's controversial or not being sensitive to the victims and the subject. So big shout out to you. Again, this is a very tough episode that I never thought I'd have to do, and I don't think anybody else thought they'd have to do an episode where there's a potential top 5 pick whose name is linked to such a tragedy. And big shout out to you, the listener, for making the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast your first listen of the day. Now, for your second listen, you have to check out the Locked On Game to Game podcast because it covers every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game is the best at giving great local analysis that only Locked On can deliver on the Locked On NBA Big Board or Locked On NBA channel. So again, follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA. It's available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Once again, it's Rafael Barlowe with Leif Thulin. Difficult show, but we are done, which I'm glad that we're done with this subject, and I hope we don't have to tackle it too much more. But we are out.